Dr. Juan Declet-Barreto is a geographer and bilingual senior social scientist for climate vulnerability here at the Union of Concerned Scientists. And he has a personal connection to the hazards facing coastal communities as he's part of the Puerto Rican diaspora here in the United States. Juan, thanks so much for being here. And can you give us a little background on how UCS's new Looming Deadlines report came to fruition?
Hi, Jess. Thank you so much for having me. Our looming deadlines analysis is trying to understand how sunny day flooding due to sea level rise from global climate change, that is flooding that happens without any clouds in the sky, just due to the increase in the sea levels and the tides. um, how this is going to impact the 90 million people or so that live in the coast of the United States and its territories. There is a lot of infrastructure upon which people depend to live their lives, and I'm talking about power plants and electrical substations and schools of all levels through K-12 and university system. There's also fire stations, police stations, ambulance services, hospitals, and that which are pieces of infrastructure that people use in their everyday lives. And if those were to be flooded and disrupted, their services were disrupted, then that would make people's lives a lot more difficult. So we sought to try to understand how that would happen if climate change goes unchecked.
That seems like a very timely thing to be looking into. So, you've seen firsthand in Puerto Rico the kind of damage that climate change fueled ocean transgressions can cause. So, tell us a little bit about what you've witnessed.
Yeah, well, I mean, growing up in Puerto Rico, I lived through a couple of hurricanes. The impacts of climate were not so clear or so dire, I should say, back then in the mid '80s, late '90s when I was growing up there. But more recently, there was, as you know, Hurricane Maria and Hurricane Irma in 2017. I was not living in Puerto Rico at the time. Like you said, I am a part of the Puerto Rican diaspora, and I have been here for something like 2 decades in the United States, I should say. And so I didn't witness the hurricane firsthand, but my family was living there. And the level of destruction is well known. The island was flattened by the force of the hurricanes, especially Maria, by the force of the winds, by the amount of water and precipitation that was dropped on the island in a short amount of time, and that um, amount of precipitation, that ferocity of those winds and the speed of those winds and the rapid intensification of these kinds of hurricanes are due to climate change. We could not have these kinds of meteorological disasters without a much warmer planet created by climate change.
So, that's storm driven disaster that humans have to deal with. But I want to talk a little bit more about that sunny day flooding that you mentioned right at the beginning. So, really define what that looks like in real terms. So essentially, if we're living on the coast and we see some sunny day flooding, what does that mean?
Well, it may be puzzling at first to see the water coming in little by little. You know, you may be in Miami, or you may be somewhere in coastal Louisiana, or somewhere in the eastern seaboard, or maybe in Puerto Rico. And there's not a cloud in sight, and yet some of the streets that are adjacent to the coastal area, to the water, are starting to get flooded. It's a couple of inches of rain and a couple of inches of water here and there. May not seem very disruptive, but that kind of flooding during sunny days without a single inch of rain falling down is indicative of climate change creating sea level rise and accelerating sea level rise, and allowing then the tides, as they naturally come in and out, to flood areas that otherwise would be dry.
Wow. So basically, I'm sitting here in LA. I'm probably 7 or 8 miles from the coast, and it's a beautiful sunny day, not a cloud in the sky. So you're saying that this sort of flooding could show up today in coastal LA with the right circumstances, and that's thanks to climate change.
This sort of flooding is starting to show up, and in our analysis, using the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration's tidal gauge data, that calculates globally what the average of sea level rise would be under a couple of different scenarios, of 1.6, 3.2, and 6.5 feet, a global average, um, would have dire consequences for a lot of the coastal infrastructure, um, along the coastal United States, which is, the sea level rise is advancing more rapidly in many parts of the United States than it is advancing globally.
Wow. So this is something that is a very real concern. So how does scientific work combined with analysis like what UCS has just done in this report, how does that move the needle in terms of real outcomes for people on the ground in these coastal locations?
Well, what we're hoping to do, as a mission-driven organization, as an organization that is interested in using policy, or that the federal government uses policy with the best available science, and to fix the climate crisis in an equitable way, is to combine such scientific data from the tidal gauges that I told you about, with the locations of various pieces of critical infrastructure. Like I mentioned, the kinds of things that people need to live, that people depend on to live their lives, to take the children to school, to power their homes, and so on. But also, there are other kinds of infrastructure that house toxic or dangerous industrial pollutants, and if those were to be flooded, then that would pose significant threats to people's health, right? So, how do we go then from the science then to moving the needle, like you said? Well, by building this report, by developing the science, by working with the best available sea level rise science and comprehensive data sets of critical infrastructure, where we show, for a number of different years, 2030, 2050, and 2100, the end of the century, under a couple of different scenarios and frequencies of inundation, what would happen to this infrastructure? Because we need to be ready for this. The seas are rising, and as a society, we're not ready for it. As a country, we're not ready for it. So we need to be able to put the protections in place that will prevent this infrastructure from being flooded twice a year, um, once every month, or something like twice a week. Imagine if the water waste treatment plant that keeps your water clean, that delivers to you potable water for multiple different uses at home, in industry, agriculture, commercial uses, were to be knocked out of commission. Here in the DC region, where I live, is this is sort of tri-state region with DC, Maryland, and Virginia. The wastewater treatment plant services nearly 1 million people. If that wastewater treatment plant were to be knocked out of commission because it's flooded, because it has to be turned off, because it can blow up, and because it can be unsafe, because it cannot operate, then that could significantly disrupt the lives and the health of people who rely on that infrastructure to live their lives. So we're hoping that this is a wake-up call, um, to policymakers at all levels, to put the protections in place to um, uh, to harden this infrastructure from these damages, to scale up investment, especially among um, disadvantaged communities, that are, many of them are coastal communities that have, for very, very long periods of time, have faced higher burdens to sea level rise impacts, to flooding impacts in general, and to any other kinds of environmental and climatic impacts.
Right. I know that that if you're already strained in terms of resources, you don't have them, you don't have enough of them, they're not good quality. Any kind of even minor disaster becomes major, and so it sounds like that in this report, you and the other scientists at UCS have really worked to identify those very vulnerable places. Yeah.
That's right. I mean, climate change is a multiplier of existing vulnerabilities, right? The vulnerabilities and the disparities that some populations have, typically and historically, and even in a contemporary way, low-income communities of color. Those disparities that they have faced have been there for a long time, for centuries, since this country became a country. They have been magnified by climate change. Those existing disparities have been magnified by climate change.
Yeah, that is something I've heard a lot in my work as a scientist is threat multiplier. That's what climate change does. So,
Right.
and it seems like you guys have done a really good job of quantifying this specific threat. So, Juan, can you give us what you believe are the most important takeaways from the looming deadlines report?
Okay. Well, I think to give people a national sort of context on what our study says is that we found that between now and the year 2050, climate change-driven sea level rise is going to expose more than 1,600 critical infrastructure assets along the coast to disruptive flooding at least twice per year. Future flooding, in particular, threatens public and affordable housing in our study. A lot of the public housing, the affordable housing is located in coastal areas,
Mm.
and that is a kind of infrastructure that services many people, especially people with low incomes, people with difficult socio-demographic situations, and that needs to be protected. Which takes me to my next point that the full burden of inundation um, in our analysis is borne very inequitably. More than half of the infrastructure at risk by 2050 is in communities that are disadvantaged based on historical and ongoing racism, discrimination, and pollution. Um, so, in terms of what to do and how we address this, we need to understand that the amount of infrastructure that's in jeopardy by the end of the century, by 2100, will depend heavily on the choices that are made about global heat trapping emissions. And this is not just a problem for the United States to address, but also globally. Policymakers and the public and private decision makers need to take immediate science based steps to safeguard critical infrastructure and achieve true and long term coastal resilience.
Yeah, I think that that's the thing that I like about the work that we do here at UCS is that we're trying to get in there where the rubber meets the road, where where action happens, and say it's not enough to have the data, it's not enough to know about the problems. We have to actually make something change.
Right. That's the thing. This is a kind of message that scientists have been saying and telling for a long time, right? The lack of action um, on our part, and I mean on our governments, on the private sector, has landed us where we are right now. And this is why this has become such a crisis. This is why we are facing these dire impacts.
So if you can explain it in the simplest possible way, how much is the risk increasing for people and infrastructure on the coast over the next several decades?
Okay. So to give you an idea, by 2050, and assuming a medium sea level rise scenario, we can expect that as many as 1,662 pieces of infrastructure will be at risk of being flooded on average twice a year. This is a nearly doubling of the number of critical infrastructure that we would expect to be inundated compared to 2020 or 2020 baseline.
Wow.
Was
So
that simple or was that convoluted?
no, that's great. That's great because I mean, that is so much more. That's what people need to
Right.
understand is that yes, we hear about problems in the news now with flooding and you hear it from time to time, especially if you're near a coast, but to think about it increasing that much, doubling is that's wild. And scary, honestly, for anybody who has loved ones in harm's way.
Okay.
Yeah. And so
I can give you the 2100 number as
oh,
well,
yeah.
which is even crazier.
Go for it, go for
Yeah.
it. Mm.
So to give you an idea of how this problem is going to continue to evolve without climate action, by 2100 and assuming a medium sea level rise scenario, which is about 3.2 feet globally, as many as 6,533 pieces of today's critical infrastructure in the U.S. Coastal areas will be at risk of being flooded on average twice a week annually. This is a seven-fold increase from
Wow.
2020.
So you're saying that by 2100, if we have just a medium scenario, not the worst, not the best, we're gonna see 7 times more flooding that we have,
That's right.
4
That's
years.
right.
That is
And And to give a clear idea what kind of flooding we're talking about, right? We're talking about sunny day flooding, right? It's flooding only due to sea level rise and the tides coming in, right? We're not talking about acute events like riverine flooding, like storm surge, like hurricanes or typhoons or anything like that.
Wow.
So
Yeah, that's
so so
just
this
from
this is
sea
on the
level.
low end. This is
Yeah.
actually on the low end of estimates, right?
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's devastating. And so just for you personally, based on the work that you did for this report, are there any geographic areas in the US or its territories that are of particular concern in your mind?
Yeah, we found a few. There are places not far from where I live, Crisfield, Maryland, along a small, mostly rural, exurban kind of community in the Eastern Seashore. Is facing a lot of potential flooding. These are low-lying areas. Tides come in. The kind of marshy areas as well. They have very old infrastructure. A place closer to home, we talked about this a little bit already in terms of impacts, Puerto Rico, especially the San Juan area and the location of the largest public housing project in Puerto Rico and the United States, called Residencial Luis Llorens Torres, where a couple thousand people live. It's almost like a small town. It's a concentrated area of poverty and disadvantage surrounded by wealthy areas. And that is very close. That public housing project is very close to the water. That these impacts in Puerto Rico are going to hit by the end of the century, not so much in 2050. But that housing project and many of the other pieces of critical infrastructure around there could be significantly flooded, at least twice a year, per year by 2100. Given the um, uh, crisis of public housing that's occurring in affordable housing that's occurring throughout the United States, and which is also affecting Puerto Rico for those and other different reasons. Paying special attention to public housing, which is the asset category in our analysis that impacts the most immediately amount of people, that represents the um, verily the most essential asset that people have, which is their dwelling, right? Whether or not they own it, if it's a rental or if they own it, it's something that needs to be protected because that is what anchors the rest of a household's ability to withstand any kind of climate impact, any kind of social, economic, climatic, environmental dislocation.
Yeah, if you don't have a place to sleep, it's really hard to hold a job. It's really hard to take a shower, which are things that are impacted when you need water treatment plants online, or any really all aspects of life come from having a place to live.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah.
yeah. So sounds like the threats to housing are really at the top of the threats that you've got here in the report. So the last question that I like to ask all of my guests, it's a two-part one. So we'll do it one part at a time. And it's because we are the Union of Concerned Scientists. So, Juan, why are you concerned?
I'm concerned. I'm concerned as a scientist. I'm concerned as a father. I'm concerned as a Puerto Rican, as a person. I'm concerned that what scientists have been saying for decades about the need to act on climate, the need to decarbonize our economy, our transportation systems, our manufacturing systems, all aspects of industrial production and agricultural production have not been heeded. And now we are in this very, very dire situation. I'm concerned that more than 1,000 people died in the annual pilgrimage to Mecca, an obligation that Muslims have, known as the Hajj. Um, I'm concerned that most of the people who died there were people who did not have the money to pay for expensive permits to officially attend. So once again, it's vulnerable. It's illustrative of vulnerable people, always being the lowest sort of priority um, for anybody. For governments everywhere, for the private sector. Um, because it shows, this is an example, but you can see it throughout here in the United States as well. The lack of concern for the well-being of people, the prioritization only of the bottom line of a few companies, of a few individuals, right, at the expense of everybody else. And there's a callousness there, there's a cruelty there, um, um, that doesn't live up to any of the promises upon which this country was built on, right? So it's um, that's tho- that's kind of scratching the surface of the things that I'm concerned about. Um,
Yes, I mean, I know there's a list, right? None of us would be scientists if we weren't concerned about something, and I think that was a one of the best answers I've ever gotten. And this is the 29th episode of the show, so well done. And so, because I don't like to end the show on the most depressing possible note, I want to lift people up a little bit. So, for some positivity, the second part of the question is, what are you personally doing about your concern?
well, I am trying to make the research that I take part on, that I co-design and co-create with my colleagues and Union of Concerned Scientists, and with external partners from impacted communities. I try to make it as relevant as possible. Try to, and this is a call to the other scientists, to those of us who train only almost exclusively in an academic way, to think that the science with the capital S is the important thing. I think increasingly for me that has been a little bit less relevant, and less important. And the thing that has become more relevant and more important is, how is this thing that you are doing going to help fix the problem that you're talking about? What is your contribution um, to the world? How do you take your privileges of learning about um, these things in the classroom, of getting a PhD, a master's degree, and use that to work with the people who did not have the privilege of learning these things on a classroom, who actually lived through it, or their relatives died in a heat wave, or a hurricane, or a flooding event, um, and work together with those folks who have that expertise of the lived experience, the expertise that many of us do not have, um, to assess that, to understand that scientifically, to find solutions that are equitable.
That is also a great answer, and I kind of want to put it on a billboard. So,
Thanks.
no, really, really well put, Juan. And I appreciate your time, your hard work on this report, which is we've made a really accessible several products from it. There's this good synopsis of the report itself online on UCS's website, ucsusa.org. And we also have interactive maps. And I mean, what you all have done, if that doesn't move the needle, then I think the only other option we have is taking to the streets and marching yet again. Because I mean,
It
this
may
is
come to that.
yeah, it might. And I think that it's always better to go into an advocacy fight when you have the data and the facts on your side. And I appreciate all the work you've done to make that available. So thank you so much for joining me. And it was a blast talking to you.
Thanks a lot, Jess.
Shana Udvardy is a senior climate resilience policy analyst here at the Union of Concerned Scientists. She is also a certified floodplain manager and works to advocate for policies that will protect people and infrastructure from climate change. Shana, can you give us a little background on what prompted UCS's new looming deadlines report?
Sure. Well, we've been working on sea level rise for quite some time, and we have been looking at some of the impacts. Previously, we put out a report called Underwater and looked at the impacts of tidal flooding and chronic tidal flooding on housing, on people's homes and businesses. But we're also interested in seeing the impact on infrastructure. And we know particularly critical infrastructure is this type of infrastructure that people rely on for their lives, for their daily lives. So it's, essential. It's critical. And so these are things like hospitals or energy substations. And so we really wanted to see what the impact of tidal flooding would be now into the mid to end of century with climate change.
Wow. So it sounds like this critical infrastructure is going to be especially vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And so, on the coasts, what kinds of critical infrastructure are we looking at with this report?
Sure. Well, we looked at a range of different critical infrastructure, but what we found was that affordable and public housing, as well as contamination sites like brownfields, are particularly at risk of this type of tidal flooding.
Wow. So basically, things that would be extremely bad for people's health in terms of the brownfields, if that gets flooded, and then uh, ruins people's housing. if,
Yeah, and the thing about the tidal flooding with public and affordable housing is that we already have an affordable housing crisis. I think a lot of people are hearing more and more about that, where people are struggling to find affordable places to live. So when we see this, the small amount of public and affordable housing that is available, and then look at this overlay of tidal flooding that's going to be projected to happen between now and mid-century to the end of the century, it is very concerning to think about how are we going to sustain what we already have, and then of course we want to ensure that there are resources moving forward so we can build and ensure there's more public and affordable housing.
Yeah, I think that that's something that often gets overlooked when we talk about critical infrastructure. People think bridges and roads and maybe hospitals, things
Right.
like that. But I don't think housing is necessarily at the forefront of the public's understanding of it. So it sounds like the report works pretty hard to show the vulnerability that exists in housing. So let's say that we experience even just a moderate increase in the amount of coastal flooding that's driven by the changing climate. What happens?
Absolutely. Well, so, this is already happening in some places. So I think that we hear about, the sunny day flooding that happens or king tides that happens every once in a while. We see this happening in places like Hampton Roads in Virginia. And many other places, even in Boston, there are areas, right in Boston that are already seeing this kind of sunny day flooding that isn't connected to a storm, isn't connected to rainfall. And so this is already becoming kind of a nuisance, we call it nuisance flooding often. And so into the future, we can imagine that if it is critical infrastructure that's being disrupted, if it's maybe an energy substation, that means that, salt water intruding onto this type of infrastructure can cause corrosion and could eventually have some major impacts. So it could be something where we're seeing twice a year type of flooding, where it could be more of a nuisance, to where it's much more frequent, where we're really going to need to be considering, okay, what are the additional impacts? Maybe there's erosion as well, or maybe there's a storm on top of that high tide flooding, which means we can get more storm surge going further inland. And so ends up being, when we start thinking about what we're expected to see in some places, definitely a big concern, especially when a lot of our infrastructure is already needing to be repaired, or is not in the best condition at the moment.
Yeah, that sounds really worrying. And so, uh, obviously, this report, it's built on analysis of a lot of different data that UCS pulled together. But what can that report do to actually help protect the critical infrastructure and people in our country?
Yeah, I think at a national scale, I think what this report does is it provides a very valuable glimpse into the bigger picture of the type of infrastructure that's at risk and at what time frame the infrastructure is going to be at risk. So this provides, a good way of understanding what needs to be done at a national scale, but also, probably it's for some communities may have this already on their radar, but I think for many others, they may not understand the particular risk, perhaps for public and affordable housing, or perhaps for brownfields. And so it provides people the knowledge of understanding, what needs to be done and when.
Yeah, and I think it's probably unusual for the average person in the US to know where the nearest wastewater treatment plant is to their house. So I think a lot of this stuff is hidden infrastructure as well, or things that we don't count as part of our essential infrastructure. So can you tell us about how much worse people and infrastructure in the most vulnerable, historically disadvantaged communities, how much worse will it be for them than places that have more resources?
Mm. Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, our report found that some of the communities that have been historically disadvantaged do happen to have more of this type of critical infrastructure at risk. And so, what we really need to do at a national level is make sure we're that Congress and the administration are putting more resources to these communities. The good news is the administration does have a current program in place called Justice 40, which helps to target funding 40% of some of the funding in the infrastructure bills to these disadvantaged communities. So that'll help to provide a few more resources to help these communities. But I think what this report helps to do is make sure the sort of under the radar risk is being put to light, and hopefully we can get even more resources to these communities in addition to technical assistance. So it's one thing to have maybe the ability or that there are grants available, but then some of these communities could actually need some help in actually applying for the grant, or and so that's where technical assistance comes in.
Huh, that's actually really interesting. And so, I mean, you did a lot of work on this report. A lot of folks at UCS did, as well as the scientists who put together a lot of the data that you used. Based on all the work that you put in for the report, were there any geographic areas in the US or its territories that are of particular concern in your eyes?
Well, in my eyes, I see that all of these places are really of particular concern. We have, in our report, there's certain states that stood out: Florida, New York, and New Jersey are some of the areas, especially, and Virginia, Louisiana. But I grew up in Rhode Island, the ocean state, and I see the risk happening here already. You see higher tides, higher storm surge, and it is affecting the higher storm surge is affecting the town of Warren, which is one town away from where I grew up in Bristol. And so I think, we're seeing some of these smaller towns really struggling to come up with the resources to deal with these kind of impacts. And so, for example, Rhode Island knows about this risk and has quite a few resources as far as online and understanding, when the risk is going to take place, but the threat of tidal flooding. But when it comes down to these smaller communities like Warren, where their wastewater and water treatment infrastructure is at risk, it's really a different picture. And trying to come up with those resources to either elevate the area, or put a seawall in, or whatever it is, or even try to get plans to move the infrastructure out of harm's way, it takes a lot of funding, a lot of planning, and so that's a concern.
Yeah, for sure. And so I know that there are literally thousands of critical infrastructure sites that are at risk, and it gets worse depending on which scenario you pick. As part of the report, there were several scenarios that were examined in terms of 2030, 2050, 2100, and then whether you've got like a low, medium, or high level of sea level rise. Um, but you've got all these different ways of slicing and dicing it. Um, but how does that affect people in terms of how many people? I know that in the media we hear a lot about people who live on the coast versus people who live in the center of the country, or the Midwest. How many Americans' lives stand to be impacted, just ballpark, by any of these scenarios?
The coastal states are one of our most populated areas, and so it's going to impact millions of people. And this will be, maybe not today, but into the future. And so when we're thinking about where we're going to be investing in new infrastructure, or even homes and businesses, we need to be sure that people are have the latest science like this to plan and then also to advocate at the local, state, and national level for policies and resources. So at the local level, this looks like something as perhaps as simple as zoning. It's usually not simple, and it usually is quite political. But there are ways to zone areas where you can encourage less development and maybe natural areas that can handle and be able to handle the tidal flooding. And so I think that while we're thinking about the impacts, we need to be thinking about all the different solutions that can be people can be working on now, including the Union of Concerned Scientists.
Yeah, it's interesting that you brought up zoning because I know that it's usually just seen as a headache for a lot of people. What's it zoned for? Wrong thing. But yeah, that's a policy tool that I think is probably an unsung hero in the efforts to try to make communities more resilient. And I was thinking about, this just came to me now when you were talking. So I know that parts of Seattle, parts of Washington, D.C., Boston were built on fill. That was basically, they said, oh, let's make land where we currently have a marsh or a swamp or, basically something you wouldn't really want to build on. Are these areas where we've kind of artificially constructed land, are they at particular risk?
Absolutely. I mentioned brownfields earlier. And so some of these areas that are filled may have been brownfields or areas that were contaminated from industrial type pollution and then were cleaned up and are considered brownfields. And so it's possible that some of this infrastructure is sitting on these brownfields or could be developed into the future.
Wow. Okay. So there could be toxic issues as well as just your typical, hey, things are flooding. That's not great.
Right.
And I think people are becoming more aware of the possibility of coastal flooding. Even just, I'm based in Los Angeles, and we saw in California just a few months back, there were tides that were causing flooding in just here along the coast. And I think it shocked a lot of people. And I'm hoping that things like this report combined with seeing the evidence themselves and hopefully not having to experience too much damage will help people become more aware of the issue. And so what do you believe are some of the most important takeaways from the Looming Deadlines report?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we in the United States have been really fortunate to have had two big infrastructure bills passed by Congress and signed into law by the administration, by the Biden administration. But I think a big takeaway is that this provides the science to understand what the risk is along the coast of this type of tidal flooding. And then we can advocate for more resources at the national level. And so while we were very thankful and appreciative of seeing these infrastructure bills in place, we can do more to get more resources out to especially these areas that may not have that tax base to pull from. And then at the local and state level, I think the message is that we can again it's same at this local and state level. While the federal government needs to be there to provide resources to a certain level, it's a good time now to start planning and understand when that risk is going to be coming, and think about policies or solutions such as maybe as I mentioned, the zoning, but also maybe moving infrastructure out of harm's way, because the big picture is that at some point we're not going to be able to necessarily adapt our way out of this, right? I mean, the tides are going to be coming, and we can build above the flood elevation, but then we also need to think about storm risk. So some of this type of critical infrastructure may be best to be moved into away from the coast and further outside of the coastal area.
I mean, I'm a geologist by training, and we've been worried about coastal erosion for since geology became a profession,
Right.
and it is something that it's going to happen even without rising sea levels. And so now that we have this extra wrinkle, I think it really it adds a new level of urgency, and then you drop in climate change driven storms that are more intense and more frequent, and it's a recipe for disaster after disaster after disaster. So there's a real urgency here, and I wanted to know, because I thought it so interesting that you are a certified floodplain manager, how does one define a floodplain, and are these definitions of floodplains, are they changing in light of new environmental conditions?
It's such a great question. And so we do have definitions for the floodplains and mapping of floodplains. The way the National Flood Insurance Program works is it's not just insurance. There are minimum standards and mapping type of programs in addition to insurance under the Federal Emergency Management Agency, but they tend to look at the floodplain, whether in a way that you're either in or out of the floodplain or out of the special flood risk area, hazard area. And so this is something that we really want FEMA to, advocating FEMA to change. It's unfortunate that FEMA is actually a bit behind the times as far as catching up with getting their mapping up to date to reflect the future conditions of climate change. And so we are advocating for those changes as well as updates to the minimum standards that can really go a long way to helping to communicate this risk and communicating that when people need to be buying insurance.
So following on from that, when people are looking at where they can move, obviously for a lot of folks, affordability is one of the biggest considerations.
Absolutely.
And so when they're looking, what can they do to sort of, I guess, prepare as best they can to make a smart move for, with this in mind, with these coastal deadlines for flooding looming in the background.
Right. So I love this question, particularly because we do actually have a resource for this. But it's so important, and it's unfortunate that many realtors don't really don't often do a great job of letting people know about flood risks, whether it's inland or coastal, and also about whether they need to buy insurance. If there is a federal mortgage that's going to be applied for, they must buy flood insurance if it's in a risky area. But we have on our website, we have a resource called Know Your Risk. And it's really nice because it's very simple. It's just a few pages, kind of a brochure pamphlet, and it helps walk people through the type of questions to ask if you're about to buy a house in a coastal area.
Okay, that is perfect. And yeah, because I know, I mean, when I've looked at homes online, I mean, Redfin has a flood risk tool you can look at for each property, but it's kind of hidden. And I mean, they have a fire one as well. But I think people are wanting resources to help themselves become more informed.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's kind of a segue. So I have a two-parter question that I ask everybody who comes on the show, and you'll see how this relates here in just a second. But the first part of the question is something I ask everyone because we are the Union of Concerned Scientists. So Shana, why are you concerned?
Great question. As I mentioned, I grew up in Rhode Island, and I find the nature and the ocean and just being in natural areas just to be kind of special places. And I'm very concerned about the climate change and the impacts on natural areas and biological diversity. But of course, on the impacts on people, we're seeing the disasters becoming more frequent and intense in some cases, heavier rainfall, and the damages from disasters increasing. And so we really need to be doing a better job at the national level of communicating how to build better, build stronger in some cases, build out of harm's way in other cases, and try to get more resources on the front end so that we can do these better solutions instead of, repairing after the fact.
That is a very valid concern, I would say. And so then this is the part that ties into what we were just talking about. And I'm hoping it's a little more empowering, because obviously we don't want to end on a total depressing downer.
Absolutely.
But like, what can we as just regular citizens do about your concern? Like, what actions can we take? What tools do we have? Like, where's our power in this?
I think, it depends on the kind of person you are. If you don't have time but you want to be doing something, I mean, not to plug the Union of Concerned Scientists, but I mean, you can become a member and and offer whatever amount you want. But the good thing about that is then you can get the information, and so you can kind of play the role you want to play. As far as being informed. Sometimes that's half the battle. But we also have advocacy newsletters where we'll get in touch with you once in a while, and you can write to your representative in a way that can really help on some of these issues, whether it's updating the National Flood Insurance Program or getting more funding for disaster assistance. So that's one easy way. Another way is voting. We always encourage people to vote, and climate change is a great question to ask any elected official what they're working on as far as it concerns climate change. And then always bring it back to your own backyard and what you care about. I think that message always resonates with people. And so if there's something that you really care about, I think make sure that your local elected official is working on that.
Excellent answer. And I love that you have different options for people, because some people don't have time to sit down and write a letter, a big extensive letter, but they may be able to say, hey, look, UCS is doing great work. Let me help support them. Let me vote for people who are running to make the changes that I think we need. So, and people who are using science and data to actually make policy. That's
Right.
the number one thing, right?
Yes.
So, no, this was excellent. I thank you so much for coming on, Shana.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Yes, this will be so illuminating for our listeners.
Wonderful. I'm glad I could help. Thank you.